Today's new lecture will be introduced by Kyoteru Tsutsui, who teaches in our Department of Sociology. Kyo.
Good afternoon and welcome to the CJS Noon Lecture. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Jeffrey Broadbent from University of Minnesota. He is a political sociologist and a Japan scholar, and his mentors I just heard was first Bob Bella at University of California, Berkeley, where he did his undergraduate and finished with magna cum laude. And then he moved on to Harvard University, and he had Ezra Vogel as his advisor. So those are two of the most important Japan scholar social scientists in the past few decades. So he comes from a really good lineage. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Jeff Broadbent.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so honored and delighted to be invited to speak at my old kind of alma mater, University of Michigan. And it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very honored that you'd attend and listen. So my talk is about the comparison of Japan, U.S., and Germany, looking at labor politics from a structural and network framework, which we'll explain momentarily. ACID stands for Advanced Capitalist Industrial Democratic Societies. So the talk covers the comparing the ACID or acid labor domains, three models, anomalies, explanations, and probing deeper, the methods of the policy network approach, findings, comparing policy networks, statistical analytical comparisons, discussion, network process and power, conclusion on structuration dynamics, and new directions with my new project, which is called COMPON, or that stands for Comparing Climate Change Policy Networks. So I'm taking the method developed in this study and applying it to an international, really up to now 20 country comparison with research teams in 20 different countries instead of just 3. So there's a lot of interesting comparisons that come up when we look at the labor policy dynamics in Japan, Germany, and the U.S. 3 of the most productive societies in the world, many broad similarities, but different in detail in terms of their labor markets, capital allocation, basic policies. So they represent 3 different systems of labor, capital, state interaction. And you can see that that kind of interaction really strikes to the heart of social theory, macro social theory, political sociology, political science, economics, in how labor, the labor sector, unions and working people, and the capital sector, management, business, and the state, making policies that govern their interaction and govern really the entire economy, all interact with each other. It draws on a lot of basic, long-argued theories, and I won't belabor them here. It also raises a lot of issues in cross-national comparison. How can we compare 3 such complicated, complex systems as national-level political economic systems like this that also have different cultural and social organizational aspects to them? Very complicated job, and trying to figure out the dimensions of comparison where we can really grasp what's important about the differences is a very difficult job, which shows up in the perennial debates and arguments about these differences. U.S. is seen as a neoliberal market mediated by party competition with the market dominant but affected by lobbying and marginal policies at the level of fiscal policies and some direct policies governing labor relations. In Germany, though, and in Japan, both, the state takes a much more active role. In Germany, the system's been called corporatism with labor, because corporatism is a system where peak organizations in the labor sector and in the business sector represent the whole sector, so that a central economic organization in the business sector represents the interests and divides up the interests of all the different business interests in the society, and the same with labor. So that's very different from the kind of lobbying and more scattered interest group approach that's found in the U.S. But the forms of corporatism in Germany and Japan are institutionalized forms are quite different. Germany has been called corporatism with labor, and others have called Japan corporatism without labor because of the relatively weaker political stance of labor at the level of national political negotiations. And in this, from the standpoint of standard U.S. political economic theory, which emphasizes the importance of the free market for productivity, both Japan and Germany, their systems were seen as anomalies, and they didn't fit within that theory. When people began to be surprised at the rise of Germany and then of Japan after World War II, they were puzzled for explanations, and there's been a lot of theoretical controversy since then. The Japanese model and the Korean model were formulated as an East Asian model, with one example being Peter Evans' theory of embedded autonomy, and others being worked by Daniel Okimoto and Chalmers Johnson and others, where the state kind of persuades business and labor to follow national plans, or national goals at least, of maximizing productivity. And then we question, what is the basis of that persuasion? Is it kind of trust or implicit bargaining of some kind? And the German corporatism model is seen as more orchestrated through the competition for political party power between the Social Democratic Party and the Christian Democratic Party, and now the Greens, and then an implementation of fairly equal business-labor negotiating power through bureaucratically set up negotiating forums. But in those, the two interest parties of business and labor have more power. So these are these two approaches have been moving away from a kind of market rational actor approach that's implicit in economics and moving into forms of what we would call institutional explanation that's become popular in political science and even in economics now, as well as in sociology. And in that spirit, we conducted this project on, well, Laumann and Moak began doing research on the actual dynamics of political economies from the network perspective. And they started with, actually not in this three-country comparison, but they started with a focus on the U.S. In a book called The Organizational State. And they, in the terms of political organization, they found a hollow core in the United States where there is no central mediating organizations, but government agencies and interest groups are balkanized into various special areas. So they theorized that this was a result of a typical result of the extreme differentiation of the polity into these different interest groups that would happen under with modernization. They were adherents of modernization theory, and that's quite similar to a kind of political extension of rational actor theory. But the anomalies of Germany and Japan called out for application of this theory and research method. So Noak organized the project and brought me in to do the Japan side, and a German, Franz Papi, to do the German side, and then I recruited to work with me a Japanese labor politics specialist, Yutaka Tsujinaka of Tsukuba University. And the hypothesis imposed by Noak on this venture was that the hollow core should appear in all three polities as a result of differentiation and modernization. And this was a good comparison, which we bring forward in this study too, because these asset societies are highly industrialized, prosperous, educated, dominant service sector, post-industrial workforce, established representative democracies with two or multi-party systems. At that time, in the 1990s, when we took this late 80s and 1990 era, they were dominated by conservative political parties, Nakasone, Reagan, Helmut Kohl, and they have similar private capital ownership and market economies and a highly unionized labor force, but declining. So in terms of cross-national comparison, you want to hold a lot of things constant so then you can focus on what's different to look at what's causing the differences between countries or between these, we could call them complex systems. So there is strong comparison in some ways here, and then in other ways there's differences. Social structural differences in ethnic homogeneity or institutional differences, as I was discussing, cultural differences, relative state centrality in policy formation. So these are give us some hints about factors that we could look at that cause different processes, different negotiation processes that we've already noted at an underlying level, why they come about. So we published some results from this project in the book that Keo showed on comparing policy networks already. That was in 1996. And we found there that Japan and U.S. and Germany did show this hollow core pattern where there weren't any really central directing or integrating institutions that covered all aspects of labor policy. But in Japan, we found a filled core. So comparison to a donut, we could call that an ampan, and which is a jelly donut. So why this Japan anomaly in particular? And also, Germany was different from the U.S. in other ways. So I've continued this investigation with more data than we published in this book. So how do we explain these differences? They're not reducible to market rational explanations. What about formal institutions, such as duly constituted sets of laws, voting patterns, bureaucratic regulations, and so forth? Or what about less formal institutions, patterns of relationships between actors that are established over long periods of time and include cultural expectations and relational expectations and cultural value expressions in their formation. And these kinds of relational patterns are dealt with in the new school of relational sociology and are accounted for in newer social theories such as the structuration approach by Giddens and the habitus approach by Bourdieu. And there's no time to get into these in depth, but just to note that these are better able to grasp these very intangible and rather, shall we say, difficult to perceive social relations when you compare them to political and economic institutions and structures and cultural categories that form the mind and relational modes of interaction between actors, these social and cultural sides of interaction that may have something to do with why the three complex systems are so different. And this means that we have to open up our understanding and definition of power, because power is not only mocked, as Weber said, the capacity to exercise, to control others even against their will, power is also persuasive. And power can work not only through coercive and economic incentives or sanctions, but it can also work through activation of common cultural categories and activation of relational schema and expectations that really form different types of relational patterns that we need to look at in this new form of investigation. So from the network point of view, the key questions are which types of relationships have real effects on power and influence in the labor negotiation systems, and do they differ across the three polities? And do nodes have agency or do networks have agency? Nodes being the organizations that are the actors in the system, and relationships being these networks of relationship that span between them in different patterns. And network analysis looks at these networks of relationships that span between them, and then what are the qualities of these different networks, and how much influence do they aggregate in the system. So we have to look at multiplex networks. How do diverse networks interact to affect outcomes? And that's what we call the structuration approach. And these networks then become habituated ways of doing things, which is what we call a habitus approach by Bourdieu. And then finally, how do we articulate such findings with extant theoretical models which more rely on political economic orientations? So the methods here, the policy network survey approaches the policy domain of actors interested in a specific type of issue in a country. In this case, we're doing labor policy issues. So we select the actors, the organizations, both in the government, in the state, and in society that are engaged in this. And these are different numbers of organizations and different types of organizations in each of the three societies, but they constitute the engaged organizations that are so relevant to creating pressure groups and pushing through legislation according to different visions and interests. And we have measures of their relative power and influence of each of the organizations. We have also different types of networks or relationships. And these represent different types of relationships. Vital information relationship about labor policy is a non-depleting. You can give it out as much as you want. Political support, however, when you take a public stand with another organization to help support their viewpoint in public, in other words, in politics, is a depleting one. You can't give it out endlessly or it becomes worthless. And then we have a third type of network which represents actors being embedded in this social network that I've been talking about, and that is what we call expected reciprocity. That if you help one organization at some point, at some time in the unspecified future, that organization will help you back. So that is what Putnam would call a specific reciprocity to other specific actors. It's not generalized towards anybody. So we have here three different types of networks that help specify different types of exchanges and relationships going on in the society. The vital information one can be distributed anonymously. You don't need to know who the person is, or it can be tied into specific others. And it's fairly fungible. It can be distributed fairly widely. The political support network is when you indicates that you're going into a specific alliance with another organization around a specific policy stance. And that's fairly restricted in who you can do that with in order to retain any credibility and power in giving that resource. And then a third network is this network that indicates that a long-standing set of social relationships pertains among a certain set of organizations, and this might have real implications for how much they're able to exchange information and give some political support, and also for their ultimate influence in the society, because some societies might place a lot of importance on this kind of relationship, whereas other societies might be much more market and rational-oriented type of politics, where alliances around issues would shift and change according to the issue. So this original survey that this data comes from, as well as the other book, is somewhat old now, but it's very difficult to get this kind of data. It took me 2.5 years, or a little over 2 years in Tokyo, supported by a string of fellowships from Fulbright and National Science Foundation, to collect this data. In the Japan case, I did most of the work. And so there's a lot of richness to it, so it's worth mining for what we can understand. At least that's been one of my projects. So this shows you some of the types of information we gathered, including the organizations include these different types. The 3 types of networks I talked about. Also, we gathered their reputation for influence. So we had some, among the 120 or so respondents who were all policy experts for their organizations, we asked them which of these organizations in this list of 120 do you think are most influential in the formation of labor policies in your country? So we have a power metric. And a lot of times people just show network pictures and they aren't able to tell what relevance this has for actual politics in the country. And we also have measures of their actual engagement and success in different specific policy events, about 30 in each country, but I'm not going to go into that data today. And our specific expected reciprocity network question is translated in English, we also had it, of course, in Japanese and German. Sometimes in politics, another organization will ask yours for political support, and even though your organization has no direct interest in the issue, you will give it. Then you will feel that you can expect a return of that support sometime in the future. Check off all organizations with which your organization has such a relationship. Then in the survey, we present the respondent with this list of 120 organizations, and they standardize for all the questions, and they check that off. So when I say this kind of network is socially embedded, I think you can see what I mean here, as opposed to a kind of spot market exchange of or transfer of information or political support. Could be anonymous. And here's the genealogy of this kind of research, but to save time, I'll jump over it. If you're interested, here's some background, how the quantitative aspects of this approach have developed. So the findings, comparing information networks. Here's the U.S. Cent Information Network. And the size, with my research assistant, there's been a little ambiguity here as to whether the size indicates the number of networks or the perceived influence. I wanted the perceived influence, but I can't claim that it does right now. I just discovered this morning. So we'll set that aside and say roughly the size indicates the importance of the organization. So in information sending and receiving, we can see that using these complicated spaghetti and meatballs network maps, it's actually a quantitative result as much as a regression correlation, but it's obviously not as reduced and condensed. So it requires interpretation. Of course, any regression correlation coefficient requires interpretation as well, but this also requires a kind of visual interpretation. But we can see that the red and pink triangles are labor, blue is government, and yellow is business interests, and then there are other ones. The green ones are various kinds of non-governmental organizations. We can see there's a rough, here, there's a very dense exchange of information going to everyone but it is clustered. Labor and NGOs tend to cluster on one side of the state, and business groups cluster on the other side of the state, and then in between are well, these red crosses here represent parties, but they didn't show up very well this time. But these are Democrats, and these are Department of Justice, OSHA, and other NLRB, other labor-related organizations. So we have a kind of state mediating the information flow here. In Germany, we have a very different pattern of information flow with a huge number of social service, state-created social welfare organizations and state organizations clustered together, and then a much tighter clustering and intermixing of labor and business, with political parties at the center there. And in Japan, the information network is much sparser and divided. This is the center, one of the central organizations of business organization. Let's see, I think so. No, this was. Oh, no, this got reversed. These are supposed to be the blue squares. My research assistant messed up here again. But this should be yellow over here. So we have business here, and we have labor over here. This should be. Oh yeah, this was not revised. Okay. So anyhow, this is business and labor with the state in between. It's rather similar to the U.S. one in terms of, but it's much more separated out. And all these things will start to make sense as I pull them together later. But just to give you a feel for that. Now, the political support networks, we have, once again, labor and NGOs on one side in the U.S. and business on the other side in a kind of scattering of state agencies. And where are the political parties? The Republicans are here, and the Republican parties and the Senate Democrats are over here. This was during a time when the House and Senate were under conservative control, as well as the presidency. And the German political support is once again very tightly clustered. And the Japan political support is highly, you could call it class divided, very intensely class divided, but highly mediated by the state. And the political parties, here's the Socialist Party, and at that time the Democratic Socialist Party were part of this left labor cluster, and the Liberal Democrats were up in the mingled. So you see a close intermingling of the state and business in the political support network. But now if we look at, so these are, I mean, it's difficult to give a simple interpretation of these. I mean, in terms of saving time, I don't want to belabor them too much, but you can see there are very different patterns, but they do show some rough similarities in terms of class groupings of political support and intermediate or work by the state to bridge between these class groupings. And in terms of information, you know, there are more or less sparse or very dense exchanges of information going on. But when we see the reciprocity networks, we find extreme differences. So the German reciprocity network, this embedded social network that I was talking about, is almost absent, virtually absent. And we don't need to go into it in depth here. And the U.S. one is also virtually absent, only 27 out of 117 organizations. And the one place where the reciprocity networks are strong is in the labor sector. And so these are all labor organizations that cluster around the AFL-CIO, which you might expect, given the way the labor sector is organized. But there are none of these long-term solidarity is the one message of the labor movement, right? That we have to stick together to in order to improve our common lot. But U.S. businesses don't think that way, and the government doesn't think that way. So it doesn't appear. But now if we look at Japan, we find that 67 here actually out of 110 or so, the majority of organizations are wrapped into this embedded, socially embedded reciprocity network. And that on the one hand, there's a labor sector that are strongly tied around their two peak organizations, as you might expect. And then there's the business sector up here, where it's extremely strongly mediated by what was then called Nikkeiren, or the Federation of Economic Employers. That's different from Keidanren, which was the Federation of Economic Organizations, you could roughly translate. But you see how intensely this works to intermediate the interests. And then the core of this whole network is the Ministry of Labor Politics Bureau, which is designated at that time by 1990 it had long been designated by the Ministry of Labor specifically to handle and harmonize kind of relations between labor and business. So the state was specifically intervening to try to move both sides towards greater productivity, but at the same time, according to my interviews with officials there, had a very strong bias in favor of business as opposed to labor. So it wasn't an egalitarian relationship, it was one more of shepherding labor in the desired way. And this system was also characterized by these advisory councils where that had strong ties to both the labor peaks and the business peaks. And that's a feature that is not in the U.S. case. And these advisory councils serve not only for information flow, but you can see they have a form of embedded social reciprocity, or a function of creating a greater sense of community and identity with the system as a whole for both sectors. So this is we could call this the business wing, the labor wing, and then a central body here that mediates both and holds them together in more than just economic or information exchange. So I call this the butterfly state, or chocho kokka. And so, I don't have time to go into the statistical, analytical properties here, but all this is, what I'm saying is all borne out and derives directly from statistical analysis of these networks. And we find also that the networks interact, as I was saying, in different ways to to correlate with each other in terms of, like, if you're in the reciprocity network, you're also in the information network type of thing, and also to correlate with how much power, how much influence being important in one network gives you in the entire system. So here we can see that in Japan, for instance, the expected reciprocity and the, let's see, do I have little things on here? Yeah, the expected reciprocity and vital information networks are highly correlated, well, at 0.3 level, highly significant correlations and much stronger than in the other two countries. And at the same time, the following, in terms of, one of the interesting questions here, which I derive from studying Nakane Chie under Bella, in her version of Japanese society, she posited that Japanese society is organized as a hierarchical vertical triangle with the major dimensions going with a common third party between two other people or two other actors. And I'm finding this kind of relationship, actually, this structural pattern working in these, at this organizational level, which actually Chie also predicted. So these third parties in expected reciprocity and vital information are important in creating direct exchanges of information between parties. That's a complicated idea, but if you're familiar with the social structural or social anthropology theory of Japanese society, it accords quite well with those predictions. And we find government organizations playing a much stronger role in Japan than in the other countries, where labor and public interest groups are stronger, or political parties, and in the German case. And we also find that reputation for influence comes out of different networks as resources for different actors. So that if in Japan you're part of the expected reciprocity network, you're also perceived as very powerful in the system, but not in the US and Germany. In Germany, if you receive political support from a lot of other actors, you're perceived as being very influential. In the US and Japan, if you give political support to a lot of other actors, you're perceived as being very influential. So there's different directions of flows of resources in these different societies. And in Japan, if you're a third party or a broker, as I said, of expected reciprocity, you're perceived as being extremely influential. So these network interactions in this theory of structuration approach that I was talking about really describe a different, we could call it, physiology of the body politic, a different flow and channeling of different types of resources that create political outcomes. So that really blew my mind. I don't know about you. So I'll just skip through the discussions. There's a lot of stuff we could go into, but basically it confirms the utility of using network theory to look at these, and it shows how our more superficial descriptions of these systems are echoed and mirrored by looking at their physiology, their flows of different types of resources and relationships, and that the notion of Japan as a relational society that Nakane Chie talks about, and the notion also of those relationships not being interpersonal trust, but being guaranteed by third-party guarantors, has a lot of empirical support as a part of the macro political social structure. So I feel like in looking at these kind of mechanisms, it's like piercing through the veil of large-scale theoretical conceptions of how things work to look at the actual flows that constitute the body politic, and we find very different body politics being constituted despite and within the larger institutional similarities. So I think this offers us a new way of looking at and comparing complex systems in general, and in this case applied to labor polity systems. So that's all.